Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I am Bhumika Sevkani, a research analyst with the Geostrategy program of the Takshashila Institution. With supply shortages arising from the West Asia war, India is increasingly faced with the question of exploring new pathways to its long-term energy security. While renewable energy is the most common solution that pops up as a response, it is faced with its own challenges. And in today's episode, we will explore the solution of small modular reactors for meeting India's energy needs. And to discuss the possibilities of SMRs, I have with me today Anwesha Sen. Anwesha here researches AI governance and power infrastructure at the Takshashila Institution and has been following the developments around SMRs closely. Welcome, Anwesha.
Thank you for having me, Bhumika.
Right. So, Anwesha, in 2025, we know that India reached the milestone of generating 50% of its installed electricity capacity using non-fossil fuels. But the increasing share of solar and wind power in these sources, it also poses the risk of unreliable supply. So despite the efficiency of these sources, they're inherently intermittent and pose challenges in managing the destabilizing effects on the grid, right? But if we add small modular reactors to the mix, it could play a role in grid stabilization while being a clean source of energy as well. So, Anwesha, could you briefly explain to us what SMRs entail? What are their advantages in terms of deployment as opposed to the nuclear power plants? And what could their applications be for India's energy requirements?
Right. Okay, to start with, brief sort of definition of what small modular reactors are. They're officially defined as advanced nuclear reactors that can produce up to 300 megawatts of electricity, which compared to conventional nuclear reactors is about 1/3 of the capacity. So it's not very significant, but obviously given that it's small and modular, it has its own benefits in terms of it being, you can mass produce it, you can produce different components of a small modular reactor in factories, and then you can assemble it on site. So in comparison to conventional nuclear reactors, the process itself is a bit more streamlined and it's not dependent on individual reactors being built. So that's a very critical sort of difference between small modular reactors and conventional nuclear reactors. So when we're talking about grid stabilization, and obviously you highlighted that renewable energies sources such as solar energy and wind energy they're not able to provide reliable continuous power, which is something that's becoming increasingly important given the rise in industries such as data centers, which again, the timeline for developing India's power generation infrastructure as well as data centers and associated infra sort of overlaps. So we need to look at how roadmaps can be created so as to account for all of these changes that are coming up in our digital infrastructure overall. That being said, SMRs do provide an opportunity for grid stabilization. One of the main challenges that we face in India is that when you're using renewable sources of energy, for example, with solar, in the evenings you don't have solar energy, you need significant amount of battery storage, which again is something that we don't have enough of at the moment. And then when we don't have that, then we move to, one option is having coal power plants, make up for the gap there. But coal plants can't ramp up or ramp down supply very quickly. It takes a couple of hours. And so it's not able to meet that sort of fluctuating demand in that sense. So then we move on to LNG or natural gas, where again we have a import dependent. And obviously, as we're seeing with the West Asia war, we're not able to meet that demand. There was recently a plant in Bangalore, Yelahanka, which had to be shut down due to the lack of supply. And so these plants are critical in stabilizing the grid currently. In the future with SMRs, we can see them as a way to stabilize the grid in that sense. So while it may not be used as a primary source of electric power generation, it can be used, and I think it will be for grid stabilization and to sort of fulfill that gap that renewable energy sources currently have. Yeah, I mean that's pretty much where we're at right now, and what an SMR entails when compared to nuclear power plants. I mean, that given that they're smaller, it also reduces the initial cost or the capex for building SMRs. But there are some nuances there which we can delve into in the future.
No, right. I think, as you mentioned, right, the modularity can help industries sort of rely on stable power if they are able to build captive power plants out of it. But then we can come to captive power plants later. But focusing on India's capabilities, what are India's capabilities and targets currently with regards to SMRs, given that the technology is still under development and that pilots are still being tested out globally, right?
Yeah, so currently where India is at, and I think much of the world is also the same place where we're still researching. There's, initial designs are out. The plants are still under development. So India specifically, as far as a government initiative goes, they have said that over the next, I think, 8 years till about 2033, we plan to have 5 SMRs, which are of different types. So right now we have one, which is Bharat Small Modular Reactor, which would be of 200 megawatts, and then followed by two smaller, lesser capacity SMRs, which will be 55 megawatts each, and then a fourth one, which is for heat generation for hydrogen power, which will be about 5 megawatts. That's also not very significant in that sense, but these are all new models of SMRs, which, at least as far as India goes, which are being developed. Right now, the building process for any of these has not been announced. So the approval process is still on. And once the approvals go through, after that, it will take another 60-ish months, so 5 to 6 years, I suppose, for actually building and deploying these reactors. And then parallelly, also, the Shanti Act came out, and that sort of, increases private participation in this industry itself. And there has been quite a lot of interest in SMRs from private players. And so you briefly mentioned captive power plants. So I think for bigger companies or industries which need a lot of power and reliable power, I think that's one way they're going to be able to meet that need, which is by developing their own SMRs, so as to not be as dependent on the main grid. But as far as actual deployment goes, we have not reached that yet. It is stated that Russia and China have their own SMRs, but apart from that, no other country has announced that they have deployed any SMRs. We do have a bunch of partnerships with other countries such as the US, Canada, Russia, France, to develop these SMRs. So right now, globally, I think where we're at is just researching, developing, coming up with initial design plans, and then I think in the near future, in about perhaps a year, we'll start seeing some development underway.
Right, interesting. But also, just to sort of expand on this India's capabilities, have you been able to map out if we have firms or capacities that could supply these projects with the required components or the required sort of services for building that infrastructure? Or do you see that we might develop some sort of import dependence going ahead even in this sort of sector?
That's a very interesting question. So actually, given our existing nuclear program, even though it currently only has about 8 gigawatts of capacity, we have been in the process, been able to develop a very significant manufacturing capability for different specialized components. So companies such as Larsen and Toubro and Bharat Heavy Electronics Limited, they have been manufacturing a lot of these components. So currently, we are actually a significant part of the supply chain itself. So at least in that sense, I don't see an import dependence for these various components. As far as the tech goes, we have established partnerships with the countries I mentioned before to have some sort of tech transfer going on. Recently, a company in Canada also came into a partnership with India, wherein they will supply a significant amount of uranium. So that's the other part of nuclear energy, right? So where uranium is a significant, obviously it's a fuel. And even there, the import dependence, we do import much of our uranium, but whether that would be vulnerable is also questionable because it's a fairly diversified supply chain. You have Kazakhstan, you have Canada, I think we have Russia as well. So there's a bunch of different players in that area. And SMRs, I'm not sure of the plans within India, but there are some designs which look at increasing the sort of refueling cycle so that you don't need to refuel again and again. Again, that reduces some sort of import dependence. But a lot of it will also depend on the design itself and whether we're able to either stockpile on fuel or how we manage that. But at the moment, on the face of it, it doesn't look like we'll face challenges in terms of being overly dependent on one player for any of the components that are used in an SMR.
That's an interesting point to note, right? So, but again, you mentioned briefly about the Shanti Act as well, right? So, if you could tell us more about what role does the Shanti Act have to play here in furthering the development of SMRs?
Right. So while there is, given that it's opened up the industry to private players, that in itself has been fairly significant because I don't think, India has, or pretty much any country would have enough state capacity to be able to mass produce SMRs, which is very critical to the economics around small modular reactors, given that it only produces up to 300 megawatts of energy. It doesn't quite follow the same economics as a larger reactor, which can produce up to 1 gigawatt, which is very significant. So the more number of SMRs you produce, the lower the cost per unit for energy gets with an SMR. That being said, also industry players are much better positioned to be able to mass produce different components. And as I said, we already have a fairly established manufacturing capability for these different components that go into an SMR. So that being said, we're fairly well positioned there, and opening it up to private players improves our chances at sort of getting ahead of the curve in that sense. Secondly, it also plays to the interests of the private players. So when we're talking about players that are not only building things in the energy ecosystem, but are, for example, steel power plants, etc. They can establish partnerships with amongst themselves to be able to develop and deploy SMRs without being overly reliant on the main grid. So that again is another way in which it reduces the dependence on an already sort of overburdened grid, and also in some sense may ensure that we reduce the transmission and distribution losses that currently occur in the main grid. And when we talk about safety, when it comes to SMRs, which was the other critical part in the act itself, when it comes to liability of the operators, SMRs are at least in design comparatively safer, while it's not very significant given compared to the recent nuclear reactors, the larger the conventional nuclear reactors, because pretty much all of them have some passive safety systems that use natural phenomena such as gravity for safety. So there's very minimal human intervention over there. And when we look at other sources of energy, and if we tabulate death rates from these different energy sources, nuclear even now is comparatively much lower than say a coal power plant, etc. So again, there the chances of, a big thing when we're talking about nuclear energy is, what if something like Chernobyl happens again? So there is that public perception over there. But, technology has come quite a long way, and those risks and fears are comparatively a lot reduced. So again, over there, the act may not directly impact the perception of an SMR. Or even in terms of regulation. It's a fairly, compared to a larger nuclear reactor, it's a fairly simple sort of model of nuclear energy, and so will have reduced human safety risks, etc. So yeah, I think overall the inclusion of private players has been a welcome move, and we do have a very lofty goal of 100 gigawatts by 2047, and it's still unclear how we may or may not meet that goal, but definitely, going beyond just plain state capacity to be able to meet that has been quite a welcome move.
Right. So I think, again, some of these things you already mentioned, but this just brings me to my final question, which is what are some of the challenges associated with deploying SMRs? So it could also mean the cost of electricity that it generates. How does that compare with, let's say, other sources like solar coupled with energy storage. What is the public perception around it, as you mentioned, and the willingness of the private sector? Does that have they sort of stepped up or shown that willingness to adopt SMRs as an energy source for the industrial facilities? So how can India then overcome these challenges? And again, are there any specific global partnerships that could prove to be useful for India for deploying SMRs?
Right. Okay. On the cost of electricity, this is a little bit of a complicated topic, given that we don't have, at least in India, we don't have any functional SMRs yet. So calculating the cost of electricity is something that includes not just the initial capex, but also how much it costs to operate the reactor. There's a bunch of associated costs like fuel and other things. So at the moment, there are some numbers out there, but we're not quite sure which one is more reliable. But on the face of it, perhaps initially it will be more expensive because, as I mentioned, it would follow the economics of mass production. So the more number of SMRs you have, the lower the cost goes. And also, since you'd have factories producing different components of it, it's better if you have more of them in number, since you can't build a larger small modular reactor. That essentially cannot happen. So that being said, where we're at right now is that we aim to have at least 5 SMRs by 2033, and perhaps a little bit more, but I don't see many of them being built in the next couple of years. So this is still a long-term gamble. So perhaps in the next, say, 15 to 20 years, when we have enough SMRs, we'll be able to actually, for one, reliably calculate what the cost of electricity has been in comparison to solar. Solar right now, with 4 hours of battery storage, is fairly low. It's 3.32 rupees per unit. And it has recently gone down. So, battery storage is one more area to look at, which is it's been growing quite a bit. So this is for one, a long-term gamble. You will need a lot of like multiple SMRs to be able to reduce the cost. And then if you're talking about captive power plants, then you can't have multiple SMRs in one area to then significantly reduce the cost of electricity. So then how would that work out versus having SMRs directly connected to the main grid? So those sort of specifics are not very clear. If, say, India, I mean, we deploy 5 SMRs to the main grid, that I don't think will significantly be cheaper than solar plus battery energy, because it's again just 5 SMRs, and of which I mentioned that one will be just for thermal heat generation, and then two are, I mean, the total capacity will be about, say, 3 to 400 megawatts. So it's not very significant. So that being said, it'll take a while for this to mature, and but simultaneously we do also have a couple of nuclear power plants which are also coming up. So overall, perhaps the cost of nuclear energy might go down, but SMR specifically, we're not very clear. Secondly, on public perception, I don't think there's been a lot of noise around SMRs particularly. The popular opinion is that they are a lot safer or that they're cheaper, and I mean, it being a lot safer is something I'm not very sure about, given that the latest nuclear reactors are also quite safe, and the safety mechanisms are very similar between the two. So that comparison might not hold directly. That being said, it is considered to be fairly safe, and even when we're talking about, say, proliferation risks with regards to the type of uranium being used, the ones that are being deployed in India or being built in India will not use uranium which is very highly refined. So that again reduces that sort of proliferation risk. Yeah, I mean, I think overall public perception, there's nothing significant at the moment. And the willingness of private sector, I think, given that there is some sort of a hype around SMRs, it is something that is being spoken about. It might be seen as a source of, it may be seen as an additional source of income that certain companies look into. Definitely for companies like L&T and BHEL, if India is building these many SMRs, they will. It is a source of income for them. But then whether other companies with who may be building data centers, etc., whether they build captive power plants, whether that the economics of that matches up, not very clear. I mean, if you're building just one captive power plant and then using that to sort of stabilize the main grid electricity, I'm not sure if that would be cheaper than having a main grid that generates enough reliable electricity directly. So I'm not sure whether how that might work out. Again, this is a long way away. The data center capacity specifically is set to increase very significantly in the next 5 years. So, and even at that point, we won't have any SMRs that have been successfully deployed. So, like I said, long-term gamble, and we're not sure where things would be at that point. So it depends on how many SMRs we're able to build and deploy, and how fast we're able to do it.
Right, and just one last question about, are there any regulations in place about radioactive waste management that pertain to SMR specifically, or what's the regulation around that?
So right now, again, as it is with existing nuclear power plants in India, a similar nuclear waste management system will be followed with overall for all nuclear reactors in India. So largely, we follow a closed nuclear fuel cycle, which minimizes the waste that is generated, and so we're able to reuse and recycle the same sort of spent fuel. And there's very small percentage of spent fuel which is generated during reprocessed and then is immobilized into an inert glass matrix, and so it's essentially stored in a solid storage surveillance facility. So overall, and also given that small modular reactors will have very limited fuel in that sense, given that the power generation is quite low, I don't think at this moment there is any specific regulations that need to come into place that's for SMR. I think the existing, since it follows a very similar design to our existing PHWRs, I think it will be able to follow the same regulations and the same waste management process currently.
All right. Thanks, Anwesha. That has been a really interesting sort of chat. And I'd say that a couple of key takeaways for me would be that it definitely makes for a more reliable supply, especially during crises like the ongoing one, right? It makes us less reliant on external sources, and it is an emerging technology that comes with its own challenges. But given that India has a manufacturing ecosystem built around it, I mean, a growing ecosystem, I'd say, and we also have some global partnerships that we can explore, it could prove to be useful for both grid stabilization and long-term energy security for India. And I think the pilot projects that we have might clear up more doubts surrounding SMRs. So yeah, thank you, Anwesha. Thank you for sharing your insights with us and joining me for today's podcast.
Thank you for having me.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.